Hello and welcome again. In Australia, we are approaching a federal general election, which must be held sometime in May at the latest. Because of the unprecedented scenes of social, economic, emotional and psychological destruction wrought by government policies over the past 2 years, there are also an unprecedented number of new political parties and independent candidates lining up for our votes. There is much advice available as to how best utilise our complex voting system to try to ensure that the two major parties no longer have untrammelled control over our federal parliament, and how to best strive to get a number of crossbench members into both houses. Before delving into that, however, we might well consider 3 questions. 1. Is it possible or even sensible to try to fight from within an obviously corrupt system to try to restructure that system? 2. What is the true or most effective remedy for the corruption we can all see is present and which is worsening despite our current efforts? 3. If the current methods are not working, why are we persisting with them? Let's look at these in turn. Amongst the major new players in the forthcoming election are the United Australia Party, UAP, fronted by Clive Palmer and crossbencher Craig Kelly, the Great Australia Party, GAP, led by former Senator Rod Culleton, and others based upon more medical than political perspectives, such as the Informed Medical Opinions Party, IMOP, led by Michael O'Neill. And of course there is the ever-present Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, PHON. It is sometimes difficult to nail these parties down as to exactly what their policies will be on various questions, though they have some obvious differences, of course. The main thrust of the UAP seems to be, we are not the 2 major parties who have wrecked your lives for the past 2 years without any effective opposition from the other major party. So you should vote for minor party candidates, especially us, and place the major party candidates, especially the incumbents, last on the ballot paper. In this way, with help from preference votes from other minor parties, it is possible for a candidate to get over the line with as little as 30% of the primary vote, especially in marginal seats, or where the incumbent has become particularly unpopular. Former Senator Rod Culleton's GAP has as its main plank the pursuit of restoring the Constitution Act of 1901, in place of the legal fiction of the Commonwealth of Australia, which is in fact a registered corporation with the American Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. There are complicated legal arguments about whether a government which voluntarily registers as a corporation is then bound by corporate law and has no more authority to impose rules or fines/fees on anybody than any other corporation, for example McDonald's, unless that person has signed a contract to be thus bound by the rules of that corporation. It is argued that our government maintains this authority by the legal fiction of birth certificates, by which our parents register us as actual possessions of this corporate state. There are ways of removing oneself from such states of legalised bondage, and the easiest one is to sign the Oath of Allegiance to the Committee of Barons, discussed in the previous 2 videos. This automatically nullifies any of the treasonous acts or statutes which attempt this imposition, and renders the fictitious government incapable of lawfully enforcing such criminal demands. Former Senator Culleton is aware of the illegality of virtually all of the current government's activities, but believes that can be undone by somehow reinforcing the 1901 Constitution of Australia Act, which we have already seen is unconstitutional and therefore unlawful, rather than pursuing the enlistment of the population under Article 61. Parties such as IMOP are basically single-issue entities which have a poor track record in electorates where people have become conditioned to expecting their political representatives to have ready-made answers for any perceived problems or inequities which may arise, rather than being prepared to deal with such issues on an individual basis. The main problem with the current system is that it is obviously and openly corrupt, with factional votes being aligned according to financial and other favours, and with candidates openly stating that their allegiances are to their parties rather than their constituents. Other extremely serious issues, which are the concern of most citizens, such as entrenched paedophilia in virtually every privileged stratum of the establishment, are either glossed over or contemptuously ignored, as evidenced by the government's suppression order of evidence of numerous high-profile offenders extending to the very highest levels of government for the next 90 years. Given that the threat of exposure of such heinous crimes dangles a social and legal sword of Damocles over anyone involved, the potential for blackmail and coercion involving malfeasance in public office cannot possibly be overstated. Anyone who seeks to enter the pit of vipers we naively call a parliament, where such depraved levels of corruption are known to exist, is placing themselves under threat of the same pressures being brought to bear, with who knows what covert threats as accompaniments. The power in government rests with those who have the power to punish, which is currently the police and the judiciary rather than the people. I argue that until this is changed, it matters little who sits in the seats of those houses. The corruption will continue unabated until the corporate legal system is replaced by trial by jury of peers, not paid magistrates or judges, and annulment of unconstitutional acts by jury, with concomitant prosecutions for MPs who enact such unlawful abominations. How we may proceed to such a state will be the subject of future talks. The answers to the second question and the third are entwined. What is our best or truest remedy for the horrible corruption we see around us? And if what we are doing isn't working, why aren't we changing methods? We have surely seen over the past 60 years, at least, that voting people into Parliament and granting them ever larger powers to enact controls over our lives does not increase either our freedom or our prosperity. Such improvements as we have seen in our physical standards of living have occurred almost exclusively because of advances made in the private sector, despite the bumbling interferences of our politicians, not because of any wisdom or probity on their part. It's easy to forget that although we all need to consume to live, politicians produce nothing, despite their boasts of job creation and improved services, etc. We almost all wish at some time that we could change the world for the better, but in reality we can best strive to make ourselves better individuals and hope that enough other people are similarly motivated that a gradual improvement in society occurs. With this question of corruption in our government and polity, it's the same issue. How much can each of us do individually to modify or improve our political system and our laws? I argue that the best short-term answer is to remove ourselves from the jurisdiction of such criminal tyrants by declaring our allegiance to the barons and standing lawfully under Article 61 of Magna Carta 1215. Each person who does this increases the pressure upon those seeking to unlawfully punish us or extract money from us. Imagine if 25 to 30% or even 40% of people informed the government that it had no lawful authority over us, that we knew that they were acting criminally and were no longer going to aid and abet their crimes by funding them. What effect that would have on the facade they have created. Is it not likely that many of them would realise that the game was up, that they cannot govern people who don't consent, and that perhaps it was time to somehow extricate themselves from the legal mire into which they had wandered? Wouldn't some of them decide to sing in slang parlance to see if they could save their own necks? There is no honour among thieves, and that is absolutely what these people are, is it not? The best part about this action is that it is relatively easy. We can begin by learning how to serve notices on the highest ranking officials we can find. After that, any contact with the lower levels of an organisation can then be referenced to the fact that their ultimate superiors have been notified that they, as well as their underlings, may be legally responsible for any unlawful actions inflicted upon citizens standing within the law. There is no conflict of interest with any other actions we may undertake, such as rallies, petitions, or even legal actions, although some of those will no longer be necessary. So vote in the election if you think it will do any good, despite decades of evidence that it will not. Why vote for people we know are going to ignore our directions? Is that democracy? I think not. Whenever in life we find that repeated actions are not producing the desired effect, isn't it normal to confront our failures honestly and admit that it's time to change some things? This is such a time. Thank you.